The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, so welcome everyone. I hope I have all the technical issues sorted out. If you can't hear me, there's a little chat box in the corner here, so type that out. I have done this in the past and forgotten to take my mic off of mute, so if there are any technical issues, again, please feel free to stop me in real time. Anyhow, my name is Mike Moffatt. As many of you know, I'm an assistant professor in the Business, Economics, and Public Policy Area Group at Ivy Business School. I give a lot of presentations to various groups on economic issues, normally stakeholders, politicians, students, obviously, and that sort of thing. I thought it would be fun to try something different, though, to open this up to a general audience. So this presentation is going to be very, very general. It's going to look at sort of 15,000 feet. I'm not going to get too much into the weeds. That said, if you find this useful and would like a presentation where I do get into the weeds, we can absolutely discuss that. So let's start with looking at the economic state of the city. And I'm a big fan of sort of clickbaity type headlines. So here's my clickbaity type headlines. London CMA's economic decline in one shocking fact. I need to define a term here, and that's London CMA. So Statistics Canada, when they look at data, they break things down different ways. And most of their data sets, when they look at regional data, are something called the Census Metropolitan Area. So they don't just look at what goes on within the borders of a city, but they look at the region as a whole, because they realize that a lot of people who, say, live in Ilderton depend on London for their economic viability. So they tend to look at these regions. So when I talk about London, I'll mostly be talking about the London CMA. But there's a lot of sort of carryover between the City of London and the London CMA, because population-wise, 77% of London CMA is people who live within the borders of the city limits. The other 23% is made up of people who live in St. Thomas, Strathroy, Lucan, and so on. So you've got a little map here that I pulled from Statistics Canada website to show you where the boundaries are. So it doesn't go out as far as Chatham or Ingersoll or Tillsonburg, but you can see the general gist of what this area looks like. So the first part of the shocking fact is that in the last decade that we have data for, Sorry, there was just a technical issue there. Last decade we have data for, so this is 2004 to 2013. The working age population of London, Ontario has increased by over 40,000 people. So again, that's London CMA. So our population has continued to grow of working age people. But jobs aren't growing. So if we look at full-time employment, the number of people who hold a full-time job hasn't increased at all since 2005. And in fact, we saw a little bit of increase in 2005, stayed pretty flat until 2008, despite the fact the population was going up, and then just cratered during the recession. So you see this big drop-off between 2008 and 2009. And the surprising thing is it's recovered very little since then. So we have about the same number of full-time jobs now as we did at the bottom of the recession, despite the fact that the working age population continues to rise. So what happened? Why did this go on? So we can dig a little bit deeper into the data. So this is an ongoing project that we're looking at Ivy, and particularly the Lawrence Policy Center. And we're not just focused on London, but we're focused on southwestern Ontario as a whole. So we're looking at various municipalities within southwestern Ontario. So here's a nice little picture of Ivy's new building, which is absolutely lovely. If you haven't seen it, if you have a chance, come on by and see our new facility. So what we're looking at is what we call the Southwest 8. So 8 CMAs within southwestern Ontario. So it's Barrie, Brantford, Guelph, Hamilton, the Tri-City area, us, St. Catharines, Niagara, and Windsor. So this is a pretty big area. But what I'm going to do in this presentation is solely focus on London because I know that's what everybody's here for. And we can benchmark London's performance on full-time employment versus Canada as a whole, versus Ontario as a whole, and as well versus the rest of southwestern Ontario, which is a big mix of places from Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo that are doing fairly well to Windsor that's doing less well, and then sort of communities in between. So we need to define a few things here. So the first thing that we need to define, okay, and everybody's saying their slides are stuck for some reason. Okay, so I'm apologizing. For the technical issues here. Hopefully everything works now. So you should be able to see a definition slide here. Okay, everyone said that looked better. Sorry, I think it was just an internet glitch on my part, but that's a good segue actually to where we're going, because we will end up talking about some of these issues. So let's define a few things. So the first thing that we need to define is full-time employment rate. And the full-time employment rate is simply the percentage of the working age population that holds a full-time job. So what percentage of the working age population at any given point in time has full-time employment? And I think they count full-time employment as 30 hours a week or more. The working age population is defined kind of strangely. It's defined as people over the age of 15. Or anybody age 15 or older. So this can include anybody from 16-year-olds to 96-year-olds. This is StatsCan's definition. This is a definition that that we've had for about 100 years, and probably doesn't make too much sense these days. Again, because you don't tend to have a lot of 16 and 17-year-olds with a full-time job, but that's how they define things. So I guess the big question is why examine full-time employment? Because there's a lot of other variables I could have used, like unemployment or things like that. Well, first of all, it's what policymakers ask about most often. So when I talk to politicians or I talk to the Ministry of Economic Development, that tends to be the one metric everybody cares about. And secondly, it correlates well with other economic variables. So although I won't be talking about wages, or I won't be talking about GDP growth, the growth rate of full-time employment tracks those variables very well. So if you're doing well in one, you're probably doing well in the other. So here's London's full-time employment rate. It's bad. That's the only way to describe it. So we start in 2004, 2005. We were actually above both the Canadian and Ontarian averages, that London was a great place for employment. You'll notice that we actually peaked in 2005, and we started to decline a little bit even before the recession, that both London and the rest of southwestern Ontario was going into employment decline before the recession hit. So this is not totally a recession-based phenomenon. That we were moving in the opposite direction of the rest of Canada, going back a few years before the recession. The recession hit, and it hit both London and southwestern Ontario particularly hard. So you see that big decline between 2008 and 2009. You notice that there's that decline everywhere, but those purple and blue lines, blue being London, purple being the Southwest 8, really get hit hard. But the last few years have been really interesting, that in the last few years, the rest of southwestern Ontario, for the most part, Windsor being a bit of an exception, but for the most part, the rest of southwestern Ontario has done a reasonably good job at recovering jobs. London, on the other hand, has not. For whatever reason, London over the last 4 years has continued to decline when it comes to full-time employment. So we're moving the rest of the way of southwestern Ontario. So I think there's a lesson here that we can't just say, oh, well, this is a big regional thing, and all of southwestern Ontario is struggling. That's not true. That in fact we are doing much worse than average. We are doing much worse than most. So this is in part a London-based phenomenon. So and we can put this phenomenon into a different term, and there's a different way of looking at it. So if our employment lane, I'm just going to back up for a second. So we saw on our full-time employment rate back in 2004 it was about 52.5. So about 52% of people, working age people, had a full-time job. That's declined now down to 46%. Had we stayed at roughly 52%, our employment rate stayed at 52%, employment would have risen by 22,000 jobs. So because of population increase, we would have saw a 22,000 job increase. Instead, employment went the other way. It fell by 5,700 jobs. So we have a gap here. We have a gap of 27,700 missing full-time jobs. And I've sort of plotted it out over time, which again, you can see after '05, we start to go into this job gap. We crater during the recession between '08 and '09, but the problem continues to get worse, that we get more and more people coming to London. Our population continues to increase, but our full-time employment rates continue to decrease to the point at which, again, we're now at almost 30,000 missing full-time jobs. This is remarkable. This phenomenon of having growing populations but decreasing jobs is something that you normally don't see outside, especially for a decade long, is something you don't normally see outside of a depression. That normally you have something like what the rest of southwestern Ontario had, where you have a big decline during a recession and then gradual growth up. This thing where we had the big decline during the recession and then a continual erosion it's unusual. I think there's no other way to describe it. Now, there's two big things that could be going on here. The first big thing is the obvious answer, that it's an economic decline, that simply our economy is not doing well, and that's the reason for our job erosion. But there could be a second thing going on, and the second thing is demographic changes. Because remember, the working age population is defined as people who are 15 years or older. 15 years or older. So what that means is if you have, let's say for a lot of 80-year-olds just moved into your community for some reason, well, that would drop your full-time employment rate because those people probably don't have full-time jobs. Those people probably don't have full-time jobs. But but that's nothing that's going on with your economy, right? It's just the fact that this measure is getting skewed because your population is changing, your demographics has changed. Somebody sent in a question about wages. Wages again track employment really well here. So all these variables track each other fairly well. So wages are going down. Wages are staying relatively flat, employment's going down, then all of these economic indicators are roughly correlated with each other, and the story, again, is one of large badness. Well, it turns out you can break the data down into, you can actually delve into the data and break this down into gaps of economic decline and demographics. And it turns out when you do that, the majority of this job gap is in fact economic decline. It's not demographic based. It's the fact that our industries simply aren't doing that well. So here's one example, and this is just one example. So this is the full-time employment rate for males aged 25 to 44. So this is sort of prime youngish male workers. In 2004, 84% of these people had a job. Now that's down to 76. It has recovered somewhat from the recession. So this is one group that's actually done, seen improvements since the recession. But still, we're at 76%, whereas before this is 84%. And if you go sort of across the board, every demographic group in London has experienced something like this, with the following two exceptions. Men over the age of 65, which is a little bit strange. So the full-time employment rate for men, senior men has gone up, which may or may not be a good thing. I mean, it's a good thing if these people want to work, but it might not be a good thing because it may be that those people are staying in their jobs longer because they've seen, their retirement savings erode or what have you. So that's not an unambiguously good thing. The other group that's done well is, or at least as far as employment rates have done well, is women over the age of 55. Employment rates for them have gone up. Everybody else across the board has seen full-time employment rates decline over the last decade in London. I am going to focus just on full-time jobs, but I know somebody's going to ask this, so I just threw it in. These aren't really being made up by part-time. It's not so much that it's a full-time to part-time shift. So part-time employment throughout all of London over the last decade is only up a net 2,600 jobs, which is not really a lot. It's about 5.2%, despite the fact that the working age population is up 11%. So it's not so much that it's a full-time to part-time transition, it's just an overall job decline. So the next thing we do in our Southwestern Ontario project is we want to see what cities are doing well in what industries. Because the idea is that, say, if Brantford is doing well in industry X, then other communities can look at what Brantford's doing in that industry and sort of follow that example if, that's something that they want to do. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at, I break work down into 7 subsectors or 7 big buckets. 2 of them for goods, 5 of them for service, and I compare how London does to the rest of Southwestern Ontario, to the rest of Ontario as a whole, and the rest of Canada as a whole. So the big depressing one is manufacturing. Manufacturing employment has cratered everywhere due to a combination of globalization and automation. We're seeing across the board in Canada employment in manufacturing erode. So in Canada as a whole, we've lost about a quarter of our manufacturing jobs over the last decade. London's decline is about 31.5%. So London's decline in manufacturing jobs has been at a faster rate than Canada as a whole, Ontario as a whole, and Southwestern Ontario as a whole. So we've been hit doubly hard here because, first of all, our decline in percentage terms has been faster, but as well because London has historically been a manufacturing center, we had more manufacturing jobs to lose in the first place. So this explains a fair bit of what's going on in London. Now, there have been other industries that have done well across Canada, the big one being construction. Over the last decade, with a housing boom, we've seen a big construction boom. And London has not been exempted from that. So London's full-time, the number of people who work full-time in construction has gone up 20% in the last decade, which is a fantastic thing. But it hasn't kept up with the rest of the country. So Southwestern Ontario has gone up about 30%, Ontario over 20%, Canada almost 40%. So, this has helped, but again, we're growing much slower than, the average of Ontario or Canada or Southwestern Ontario. But as well, because construction is a smaller industry than manufacturing, that really hasn't helped made up the job loss. So London lost 12,700 jobs in manufacturing on net, but only gained 2,800 full-time jobs in construction. So these things don't even out. And again, in both of those good subsectors, we finished dead last as compared to these other 3 benchmarks. Okay, so let's look at some of the services. So we have full-time employment in trade and transportation. So these are things like warehousing, trucking, that sort of thing. London's growth is we have grown. It's hard to see here. We grew about 0.2%. This is an industry not seeing a ton of growth throughout the country, but Southwestern Ontario saw some gains, and Ontario and Canada each grew by about 6 to 8%. London, we finished last. So finance, insurance, and real estate, you would think that this would be one that we would do relatively well in. London has historically been a big center for finance and insurance. Unfortunately, we finished dead last. Southwestern Ontario has grown about 10%, with Brantford doing particularly well. Ontario's up 20%, Canada's up 15%, we're up about 5%. So we finish dead last. Okay, next one. Business, professional, and other services. I think this should smash a few misconceptions. I often hear the narrative a lot that London's over-focusing on service jobs, that we're trying to put too much in the service bucket. The data really does not bear that out. That if you look at Ontario and Canada as a whole, these types of business and professional service jobs are increased by about 20% over the last decade. London actually declined. We lost sort of these white collar type service jobs. These aren't. I shouldn't necessarily say white collar, because these aren't all white collar service jobs, but a lot of the ones in this bucket are. We actually faced decline. So again, another area where we finish dead last. Another narrative I hear a lot is London's problem is that public sector jobs are crowding out private sector jobs, and that the government is hiring too many people, which is making it hard for private industry to hire them. Again, the data really does not bear this out. That due to an aging population, we're seeing healthcare in particular, and this is both public sector and private sector, but education, healthcare, public administration has seen big gains across the country, mostly on the healthcare side. The jobs are, we saw a 20 to 30% increase in jobs sort of across the board. London's been less than half that. Ours has increased about 12%. So again, we finished dead last, and we're well behind not just the rest of the country, but we're well behind our neighbors in Southwestern Ontario. And then finally, there's sort of a bucket for everything else, which includes everything from accommodation jobs to jobs in IT. We finish dead last. Again, at less than half the rate of Ontario's average, or even Southwestern Ontario's average. So you're noticing a trend here. We're finishing last across the board, in these 4 benchmark groups in every single area. So what basically happened over the last decade is manufacturing cratered and nothing really replaced it. I mean, if we were able to break down this data into smaller and smaller subsectors, we would find green shoots. We would find smaller sub-industries that in fact have done well, and companies that have done well in London. But on a big macro scale, big macro employment scale, the story is very simple. Manufacturing employment cratered, and nothing else did well. We didn't get the BlackBerries or OpenText or finance jobs or healthcare jobs that could have replaced those manufacturing jobs. Simply did not happen. So let's look at this demographic issue. And this demographic issue is an important one, because like most of Canada, we're undergoing some really significant demographic changes, and most notably the aging of the baby boomers. So the best estimate I have is of this 27,700 missing jobs, about 10,000 of this can be explained by changing demographics. The fact that, and by changing demographics here, I mean mostly our age profile, that the age of London's population changed dramatically over the last 10 years. So we can show this in 2 ways. The first is we can break age groups down into different buckets. So we have 15 to 24-year-olds, 25 to 44-year-olds, all the way up to seniors. The first 2 groups saw declines. In fact, the population of 25 to 44-year-olds has gone down in London over the last decade. 45 to 54-year-olds saw modest increases, and just massive increases in the population of people over 55 and over 65. That more than 100% of London's population growth is in people, net population growth is people over the age of 55, which is just remarkable. So we can show this a different way and do this in terms of percentages. So we see that, for our two younger age cohorts, that the populations have decreased by about 5 to 10%. People in their late 40s, early 50s has increased 10%, and these final two groups have each increased by 50%. So the number of people between 55 and 64 has increased by 50% in just a decade. This is not a long time. And the proportion of seniors in our population, again, has increased by over 50%. So what's causing this? And it turns out it's mostly just population aging. It's that that people, the people that we have are sort of increasing into buckets. They're sort of graduating into new categories. So it's not that, all of a sudden we have a bunch of 70-year-olds moving to London. That's not what's going on. This is mostly a natural population aging thing. Now, I'll give you an example of this. So I really like to compare London to Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo, because the two CMAs have roughly equivalent populations. They're both in southwestern Ontario. And I've got these migration estimates, and I should indicate that these are estimates. Don't be fooled by the exactness of the numbers here. So take these with a bit of grain of salt. But Statistics Canada keeps track of net migration patterns. So they look at people within province. So within province would be, say, somebody moving from Windsor to London or Windsor to Cambridge, Waterloo. Over the last decade, you've seen on net about a 1,000 to 2,000 population increase in each community. So that's net. So you have two people move from Windsor, one person move to Windsor. That's sort of a plus one. Out of province would be people moving, again, to Alberta, Saskatchewan, to outside of Ontario, relative to people moving in there. It's roughly zero. These things roughly cancel themselves out for seniors. And then we have international. So this is migration into or out of Canada. So it's basically immigrants coming into London minus, the people who move from London and move to Florida permanently. So if we take all of those people over the last decade, it's increased the population of these two centers by about 2,000 people. So again, that's not a lot, because we were talking about increases of 20, 25, 30,000. So an increase of 2,000 people really isn't a whole lot here. And you'll notice that London is actually slightly ahead of Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo. On net, we've attracted more seniors than they have. But, I mean, this is, statistically speaking, this is roughly a tie. The same does not hold true, though, for 25 to 44-year-olds. That, in fact, migration patterns play a much bigger role here. So again, let's compare London to Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo. Within province, London is basically gaining as many people as it loses. So, you have people moving to Toronto from London, people from Toronto moving to London. It's all basically netting out. Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo, on the other hand, has seen a net increase of 5,000 people in this age group. So you have a lot of people within Ontario are moving to Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo from other parts of the province. Out of province, and I find this one particularly interesting, that even Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo on net is losing people to other provinces. And I think a lot of that, as far as we can tell at Ivy, a lot of that is blue-collar workers. So manufacturing, even in Cambridge, KCW, has taken a hit. And it looks like a fair bit of blue-collar workers from Kitchener are moving places like Fort McMurray. So on net, they're losing people to the rest of the country. So are we. And international, they're on net, excuse me, attracting more people than we are. Now, London is still attracting on net, a nice proportion of immigrants, and that's the one thing that's really saved our population here. Is that we still on net attracted 6,200 immigrants of this sort of population slice, whereas KCW has been about 9,000. So that's been one sort of positive sign. But overall, note a huge difference here, that our population, due to migration of 25 to 44-year-olds, has increased by about 3,500, whereas the Tri-Cities has been about 12,000. Had London been able to have similar numbers to the Tri-Cities, then this population decline goes away, that we basically net out even, which would have been a fantastic thing. So you'll see here that, as we see here, that people are voting with their feet, and they're voting to go to Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo, and not London. And it's not surprising. The reasons aren't surprising. The big reason is there's simply no jobs here, or at least there's a decline in employment here for people in this age cohort. So people are choosing to go to other parts of the country instead of London, because London is severely lagging when it comes to full-time employment for 25 to 44-year-olds. It's a really easy concept and really easy story to understand. This is not a very complicated things that are going on, that people are voting with their feet. And if you look at the communities that are growing between 2004 to 2013 with 25 to 44-year-olds, if you take all the CMAs that existed in that time, so there are 33 communities that StatsCan has as CMAs. London finishes 24th. We finish ahead of places like Sudbury and Thunder Bay and places like that, but we're near last. The places that did well, first was Saskatoon, second Edmonton, third Calgary, fourth Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo, and fifth Regina. This is a really easy story to understand. Why are people going to Saskatoon? Why are young people going to Saskatoon? It's not the climate. It's not the nightlife. It's not a whole lot of things. It's because they can find work, that wages are high, and there's a lot of job opportunities. End of story. So it's a really, really, basic but important thing here. And Fort McMurray during this time didn't count as a CMA. They didn't have enough people to qualify as a CMA back in 2004. But had they would have been off the charts here. But again, people are voting with their feet, and it's not, it's not the Torontos and Vancouvers and Montreals that are gaining all the young people. Again, it's your Saskatoons and your Edmontons and your Reginas. So a sizable portion, just to summarize, a sizable portion of what's going on in London is demographic changes. That's one of the reasons why we're in a job decline. But not all of that demographic change is sort of natural and just due to aging. That some of it is, in fact, due to people voting with their feet. Yeah, I'm getting immigration that the net migration numbers are just people, the number of people who go, come in versus leave. So if somebody comes in and then leaves, that sort of nets out. So that's just the net number of people. It's a sort of net number of people between one year to the next. So it just counts, how many people come in from the country, in from, say, the rest of the country to the number of people who leave from the rest of the country. It just compares year over year. Like that. Sorry, guys are bombarding me with questions, which is awesome. I'm trying to get to as many as possible. But if I don't get to your question, and chances are I won't, feel free to email me after the end of the presentation, because these are really awesome questions that are coming in. But I can't look at them all, or I find it rather distracting. But these are great. I'm really glad that you guys are so into this. And again, young workers are voting with their feet, and they're going to places they can get jobs. It's a very simple thing that's going on here. Okay, so moving forward. So basically, now I've depressed you all horribly. I'm going to try and depress you more, and then, hopefully shine some positive light on here. So, and I'm really hoping that the takeaway from this is not, oh man, I really need to leave London, but rather, hey, this is a big problem, but there are things that we can do about it. So the nightmare scenario that in my view, that we have to worry about is that this basically continues. And as it continues, the ratio of retirees to population rises. So you get a whole, the sort of the proportion of seniors goes up and up and up relative to the population. And then the population starts to shrink as baby boomers age and die off, for lack of a better term. When that happens, you're going to have a smaller tax base to cover a large area of infrastructure. You have a smaller tax base for two reasons. That one is that your population is shrinking, and two, that the people who are sticking around are basically living off of retirement income. They're not generating new income. So what happens then is you start to, again, you have a smaller tax base that has to look at over this large infrastructure, roads, water infrastructure, and so on. And then you start to also see a wave of closures. So, what's going on with Lorne Ave, times 10 or times 100. And that's a problem not just for the municipal government or other governments, but it's a problem for you and I and everyone else, because like most Canadians, a lot of Londoners are depending on their homes to be the store of wealth for their retirement. So, a lot of people's plan is to live in their home until they're 70 or 75 or 80, then sell that home and use that money for the next 15 or 20 years to fund their retirement. Problem is, there has to be two sides of that transaction. That for every home sold, there has to be someone to buy it. Well, if your population is shrinking, your real estate values are going to go down really, really quickly, which is a big problem if you're counting on the value of your real estate to fund your retirement. So it's crucial that not just for the municipal government, but for a lot of people in their 40s and 50s who are counting on their homes to be, fund their retirement, it's important that this doesn't happen. And, I don't think we should believe that this is just scaremongering, or this is just me being hyperbolic, because it's happened a lot of other places, particularly in the U.S. So anywhere from Rochester, New York, to Cincinnati, to Hartford, Connecticut have seen this, that they've seen graying of the population decline in real estate values. So this is a very real possibility, and we're seeing this even in Canada. So Chatham is undergoing this right now. That Chatham is undergoing a population decline, not so much an erosion of real estate values, fortunately, but a population decline, which again causes problems when you have a smaller tax base that needs to keep up all this infrastructure. So I should point out that I am a fan of the London plan. I do like the London plan. I think a lot of work has gone into the London plan. I think it's a fantastic blueprint. But I do think there's a caveat here, that the London plan assumes that population will grow by about 77,000 people in the next 20 years. I think we have to understand that is in fact an assumption, that's not necessarily going to happen. So we can't just sort of count on natural population growth to get us out of this, because as we've seen, people vote with their feet. So just because we've seen population increases in the past does not mean that we'll necessarily see population increases in the future. So now I've spent 39 minutes depressing the heck out of you. I'm going to try and take this in the opposite direction. So I think there are reasons for optimism. But first of all is that it's impossible to have a worse decade for manufacturing employment as we saw in the last decade. We're not going to have another decade where we lose 12,700 manufacturing jobs. It's not going to happen. So, things aren't going to continue in that direction. There's an ongoing, continuing to this day, an ongoing rural small city to urban migration. So London has been gaining population at, Tillsonburg and Ingersoll's and so on expense, and that's probably going to continue. That this is a general trend happening all over North America. That people are migrating out of smaller communities and into cities, not necessarily large cities, but cities. So that plays into sort of London's favor. London is still very attractive to international immigrants. I think that this doesn't receive enough attention, that we are very attractive to international immigrants. We have fantastic immigrant communities here, and that's something that at all three levels of government you want to ensure continues, that we get more international immigrants, and the ones that we have here, we help find employment and those sorts of things. Because again, if we get to a situation where, the international immigrants can't find jobs in London but can find jobs somewhere else, that well is going to dry up. But this isn't showing any signs of happening yet, at least not in the data. And then finally, we have the power to do something about it, that we don't just have to sort of let these things happen, that there are policy instruments at all three levels of government that can be used to change these sorts of things. So again, I'm going to view this at 50,000 feet. I'm not going to go too much into the weeds and say, okay, here are the 7 or 8 policies we need to do, and here's why. Simply, and the reason why I'm not going to do that is because with any of these policies, the devil's always in the details, and I could give separate webinars for sort of each of these. And if there's enough requests, I very well may do that. But I think it's important to sort of get the lay of the land and to think about, like, what do you want to think about? What's important when you're deciding, okay, here are the policies we're going to do at a municipal level, or if you're a municipal politician, here are the things that we're going to press Queen's Park for. Here's the things we're going to press Ottawa for. And we have to understand that obviously this gets said over and over, but I'll say it again, unless government's directly hiring people, they're not going to create jobs. But government plays a key and important role in creating the environment for economic growth and prosperity. Again, nothing you probably haven't heard 1,000 times, but it bears repeating. And one really important environmental variable, not the only one, and by far not the only one, but one really important environmental variable for government is creating the environment where firms can get their goods to market. So creating the infrastructure necessary that if I own a company, I can get my goods to the end consumer. And goods here I'm using very broadly, that we have to understand that goods are not just physical products. And in fact, they're less and less so. That getting goods to market does not mean necessarily shipping a physical product. More and more in the 21st century, that the good is data. So I've got something I've worked on, and I need to, some data product I've got, and I've got to, send that down the pipe to a customer in San Francisco or Tokyo or where have you. And the third one is people, that as we move more to service-based industries, a lot of what you're selling is essentially yourself. So you have a consulting firm and you have some clients someplace, how do you go see them? Some of that is done virtually through data, through Skype, through webinars and that sort of thing. But, face-to-face contact is still crucially important in advanced service industries. So the public policy goal is to use our very limited money, time, and political capital. We can't do everything. We can't invest in everything. And that's not just in terms of money. That there's only so many issues that can be debated, so many policies that can be discussed. And politicians only have so much political capital. You can't, if you're a municipal government, you can't run to Queen's Park and ask for 300 different things. So you have to sort of triage and ask yourself, okay, well, what can I get? Well, what can we get as a city? and what would be of actual value to us. So we have to use those resources to create sources of sustainable competitive advantages. So where are the areas that London firms can compete in, and as well use those resources to leverage existing competitive advantages. So things that London already does well. So the London plan, after not criticizing, but after putting a caveat on the London plan, I would suggest actually reading it because it does a good job of identifying these competitive advantages, what London does well, and where London needs to go forward. So the London plan, by necessity, because it looks 20 years out, is very general. It's sort of overarching. It doesn't delve too much into specifics. I mean, it's a couple hundred pages, so obviously there's some specifics there. But, it's, again, sort of a big picture view. But if you haven't read the London plan, I would start there, particularly the parts around, I think it's around page 180, where it talks about things like the Smart City Initiative. I think those are crucial to understand. So what are London's competitive advantages? So I've highlighted a few here. Highly educated workforce. As we all know, we have Western, we have Fanshawe, we're a big source of higher learning. I've highlighted the next one, low cost of living, because most of the competitive advantages here could apply to pretty much most of Canada. So it could apply to a Toronto or a Vancouver or a Calgary. But here's one that I think is unique to London, that our real estate values and our property values are relatively low. Our cost of living is relatively low. And that's nice for a couple reasons. That there are a lot of business models that simply work better in London than work in Toronto, because it's cheaper to live in London. Therefore, you don't have to have the same level of wage to have the same standard of living as you do in Toronto. So, you're comparing, a house in Toronto that might cost you $800,000 to one in London that might cost you $250,000 or $300,000. That's a much, much lower cost of living. So there are a lot of companies that can compete in London by the fact that they're essentially arbitraging that difference in real estate. So I think that's a really big one to understand. Proximity to prime agricultural land, again, is an important one. Strong policy environment and regulatory standards. So I often get hear people in the street going, well, isn't everything just going to move to China? Well, no, for a variety of reasons. One is highly educated workforce, but second is things like strong policy environment and regulatory standards. I was recently in China about 2 months ago, and the one thing you'll notice when you go to China and talk to people in the burgeoning middle class is the first thing they do when they go into their middle or upper class is they stop buying food made in China. They don't trust it. They see the air pollution. They see the water pollution. They have a distrust in the government. They don't expect that the government will tell them the truth about what's going on. And they place a real value on food made other places, particularly interesting enough, Australia and New Zealand, and part of that is just geographic proximity, but also they believe that those two countries have very high safety standards when it comes to food production. So, I don't think we should always think that everything's going to move to China, everything's going to move to Mexico. That's not the case. And when you go to China, you see the massive demand they have for our exports, particularly our food products, but as well, things like cars and other things with safety issues. Because again, there's a fair bit of distrust when it comes to among middle class Chinese when it comes to Chinese safety standards and Chinese government transparency. Again, our diverse population and immigration policy. And finally, brownfield assets that can be repurposed. We have a lot of prime real estate that's not being used for anything right now. So, it's one of those strange things that comes out of an economic decline is it leaves behind a whole bunch of assets that can be repurposed for something else. So what are our disadvantages? Well, after saying that not everything's going to China and Mexico, clearly some stuff is. That, this is a expensive place for low-skilled labor, that a lot of business models that utilize low-skilled labor really don't make a lot of sense for London, that those companies are either moving elsewhere or finding ways to automate, so replacing humans with robots. Companies, when we talk to companies at Ivy, we had a Future of Manufacturing conference back in November. There are a few things that they said are issues. One was relatively high energy costs. That's arguable. It depends on the industry. Another big one that they pointed out over and over again, they said that was their primary concern, was infrastructure in the border. That it's difficult to get products, physical goods, across the border in a timely fashion. And as well, I had dinner with a C-level executive of an auto parts company that does a lot of work with GM Oshawa, and they were pointing out that just what a headache it is getting cars from GM Oshawa or parts from GM Oshawa to the United States, because to go to the United States, you're pretty much having to go through Toronto traffic, which is a huge nightmare. And then finally, for London, a big issue that comes up when I talk to a lot of small and medium-sized business people is the proximity to major international transport hubs. The fact that London, if you need to get to, if you need to get to a Boston or a Denver, someplace like that, it's a lot harder to do from London than it is from Toronto. Or the new flight we have to Newark will definitely help. High-speed rail from here to Pearson will definitely help, but that's 15 years off the road. But anyhow, it's something that companies mention again and again and again as an issue. So governments don't necessarily need to pick winners or losers. It's not what I'm suggesting here. Is that the municipal government should go, okay, well, these 5 companies are going to be our future, so let's just fire hose a lot of resources at them and watch them grow. But it is helpful to have an understanding of what industries are likely to do well, because it helps you figure out what infrastructure or other projects you want to invest in and which ones are sort of nice to have but aren't need to have. So it helps you make better use of your limited resources. So I'm going to give 5 industry examples. These are just examples. This is not meant to be exhaustive, but rather I just want to sort of illustrate the kind of thinking that you can do here. So this is going to be oversimplified, or at least simplified, but that's on purpose. So first, again, labor-intensive manufacturing. We do actually have some competitive advantages in London. That we do have, again, those existing brownfield assets that can be repurposed. We do have skilled labor, but there's some very competitive disadvantage. That, again, very high-cost jurisdiction, and as well that our safety and environmental laws are a lot stronger here, which I think is a fantastic thing. I'm not suggesting for a moment that we weaken them, but companies that are looking to sort of cut corners and cut costs at all, at any cost, would not find that attractive. But that's all right, because we can go into other things. So second one, advanced manufacturing. So again, very competitive advantages here. So skilled labor, we have some brownfield sites, some greenfield sites near the 401, existing supply chains for parts for the most part. We do have some competitive disadvantages for this industry. First of all is energy costs, and I put arguably there. Depends who you ask. Secondly is geographic proximity. Again, depends who you ask, but if you're a North American firm and say you're manufacturing things to export to Asia, probably makes more sense to be on the West Coast than it does in London. But it really depends on what your target market is. And there's some competitive challenges here. The first competitive challenge is you want to make it easy for companies to start up in your area. So that, again, that's not necessarily just fire hosing cash at them, but it's making them easy, making the process straightforward to get permits. I'm a big fan of what London's doing with the single desk concierge service. I think that's fantastic. And again, just those little things that you can do to help companies, get their water set up, get their energy set up, that kind of thing. And by easy, I mean in a straightforward process. Again, not necessarily fire hosing money at them. And again, the second is ease of getting products to market just in time, including the border, which is more a challenge for a federal government. There's not a lot municipally you can do about that, but I'm throwing that in there. So clearly, there's an important role for government here. So government does have a role in making sure all of these things happen. Here's a fun one. So I'm going from sort of very general, very broad ones to specific ones. So one industry that I know is burgeoning here in London, is starting to do well here in London, is audio-video editing. Big competitive advantages here. Skilled labor. I mean, we have some fantastic programs at Fanshawe and Western. Low cost of living and low real estate costs. So it makes you can hire a qualified video editor at a much lower cost in London than you can in Toronto because of those cost of living issues. So this is a really, really nice, in my view, really nice industry for London to be in, that it takes advantage of all of the things we do well, that we train people up to do these things, and we have and we can get them to do that at a lower cost, because there's a lower cost of living, but there's also a lower cost for these companies to set up shop here. Because they do require a certain amount of office space, and our office space is significantly cheaper than the Torontos and Vancouvers of the world. But here's our competitive challenge. So the product here is data, right? That if you're doing particularly video editing, so you've got some video that got shot in Toronto, you can always FedEx or UPS physical media, but most of these days everybody wants to do things via data. Does London have the internet speeds necessary, or the bandwidth necessary, to be able to take the raw product that was shot in one area, process it here, and then send it back somewhere else? And I think there's an important role for government here, because there's likely, there's likely going to be market failures here, that that internet bandwidth as sort of a big scale tends to be a monopoly, tends to get a little bit underinvested in. So there are roles for smart strategic investments by municipal and provincial governments, and federal governments here too, if they want to open their wallet. So this one industry would suggest that fiber optic and transmission infrastructure, which are mentioned as items 725 and 726 on the London plan, may be higher priority than municipal Wi-Fi, or item 724. That's just for this one industry. I don't want to suggest this is a blanket claim, but this is the kind of thing you can think about, is going, okay, well, what are the industries that are likely to do well here? What type of infrastructure is likely to be more valuable to them than less valuable? And clearly, one of the things you want to do here is talk to the industries that already exist and ask them, these questions. So, in this case, I've talked to a couple of companies working in this field, and this is where this information comes from. Sorry, just having another technical issue here. Fourth one, really big one, agri-food. So our competitive advantages here, again, availability of farmland, high-skilled labor that can be important depending on what's being grown and processed and that sort of thing. And here I'm going to put strong regulations. So I think it's really important that we not see regulations as necessarily a barrier to economic growth and a barrier to jobs. When regulations are done right, they can in fact enhance industries. They can enhance industries because if people believe that, hey, Ontario has very strict regulations when it comes to food safety, people outside of Ontario are going to hear that, are going to want our food. That reputation is important, and that reputation comes in part from decisions that government makes. Competitive disadvantages, there's not a lot here. That arguably labor costs, though this isn't a particular doesn't have to be a labor-intensive industry. And the
the labor-intensive parts of the industry, there are programs in place. So I'm thinking of like harvesting type programs in place to deal with those labor cost issues. Some people might point to strong regulations making this difficult, so I put that arguable. Again, to me, if the regulations are done right, the strong regulations actually work in our favor. So our competitive challenge here is, does Southwestern Ontario have the infrastructure needed to get these products to market quickly and cost effectively? And I think these aren't just necessarily roads, rail, air, but I think food terminals are important. Do you have the place where growers can get together, bring their food to market, have people buy from a single area? So you have that sort of common market where buyers and sellers can come together, because agriculture tends to be a fairly fragmented industry. So food terminal infrastructure, I think, is absolutely vital. And Ivy, my colleague David Sparling at Ivy runs our Agri-Food Institute. I think is doing fantastic work in this area. So this is as much as I want to say about agri-food, because David's the expert, but here's, again, something where him and I have discussed at some length. And 5, I'm throwing technical consulting services. So this can be anything from IT companies to web programming companies to the company I own, NextReg Compliance, where you have people who have knowledge of a certain area and provide that knowledge across the world. So the classic one that everybody knows in London is Infotech, but there's a lot of other companies in this space. Competitive advantages. This is going to look a lot like video editing. Skilled labor, low cost of living, low real estate costs. But unlike video editing, or maybe to a larger degree than video editing, that the product here is as much people as it is data. That a lot of this work still happens on site, that you still need to have consultants or salespeople visit clients in international markets. You still have to go on site for things. And I know I've spoken to a number of companies in this space, some of which who have actually left London. And the reason why sort of across the board they left London is they said, well, look, it's too far from Pearson Airport that, I can be in a place like Cambridge, do the work there, and then when I have to go on site, go from Cambridge to Pearson rather than London to Pearson. It's just too hard and difficult and expensive to go see the end client. So there's a big competitive disadvantage here. So here's one that could go either way. So I throw this one in because A, I think is important, but B, it shows you that this thinking is not always clear cut. That, is this an area of growth for London? It's really hard to say. On the one hand, you would think it would be very good, that we have a lot of smart people here who know a lot of things, have low real estate, so low costs there. So you think, okay, well, these types of companies really make sense in London. And we've got a history, again, of the Infotechs of the world who have done well in that space. But on the other hand, there's a pretty big competitive disadvantage here. And if we're going to do well in this space, we're going to have to address that competitive disadvantage. So what this means is either finding ways to get people to and from Pearson easier, or airport expansion. Making it easier to fly out of London Airport, which not just easier, but cheaper as well, more competition, those sorts of things. And I think this is the kind of area where if you're going to do this and you think this is an area for growth, you really want to push it. That I think half measures aren't enough. So, you've really got to push finding ways, again, to move people into and out of London quickly, because right now we really don't have that. And again, from the executives I've talked to, some of which who have left London, cite this as being a big issue. So that's it. I went a little bit over time, and my apologies for that. But based on the vast number of questions that you guys sent me, and comments you have sent me, which have been amazing. Thank you, by the way. I wish I had a chance to get to them all. But to do little takeaways here. So, the first takeaway, this is really, unfortunately, a lost decade for London. And I think there's a real view out there that people feel like, that, well, we love London, so we don't want to talk London down, so we need to cheerlead. And I think that's a little bit dangerous, that I think there's nothing wrong with admitting that there have been issues here, that it's been a difficult decade, but realizing that we need to use that as a motivation to move forward, that Londoners are strong enough to solve these economic problems. But I think just sort of ignoring the problems or believing they don't exist doesn't really help anyone. And just simply cheerleading all the time. That I think there's nothing wrong with going, okay, yeah, it's been a really tough decade, but here are all the great things that we're going to do forward to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So, that the one challenge has been just basically the economy's been really lousy, coupled with this demographic, baby boomer issue. That again, the boomers are getting older, starting to retire, that sort of thing. And because of these issues, because of the economic issues, youngish workers are voting with their feet, compounding population aging. And the problem with that is if that continues, we're going to see an erosion of the tax base and an erosion of real estate values, which is not going to be good for anyone. So this has to be the problem we solve. If London is going to move forward, we have to solve this problem. So how do we keep young workers in London? I have a 10-point plan. It's jobs, 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 jobs. That's really all there is to it. People, again, aren't moving to Saskatoon and Regina. And I don't mean to run Saskatchewan down. My dad's family is from Saskatchewan. But people aren't moving there, again, because the libraries are really nice. People are moving there for economic opportunity. That said, I think libraries and bike paths and all of these quality of life things are very important. They need to be done. Again, we all live in London. We want to have the nicest city possible. But let's not think that that's going to attract people here. Let's not think that that's going to be the economic renaissance. We should do those things because those are just nice things to have. We should not do those things thinking that that's going to stop this demographic slide. There's really no evidence of that. All the evidence we have of location decisions for people in their 20s and 30s is based simply on employment, wages, full-time employment, opportunity for growth, all of those things. That's what largely determines, or almost completely determines, the sort of aggregate number of people who locate places. It's nothing else. So we have to solve the employment problem. We have to solve these economic issues. So in order to do that, again, because unless the City of London is going to just start hiring people in their 20s, 30s directly, the only way they're going to do that is by being able to create an environment for growth. So we need smart public policies at all three levels of government that's forward-looking. So we can't think, well, we had a lot of great manufacturing jobs in the 70s and 80s, so let's try and get all of those back. That's where the puck's been. That's not where the puck is going, so we have to understand that. And we have to be able to play to London's competitive advantages. Again, I can't stress this enough that we need to discuss with growing London companies. When I meet with an entrepreneur, and I've met with many entrepreneurs in London during this project, the first thing I ask them is, what is the one thing that is preventing your company from growing? What is, where is the bottleneck? What would be the one thing that could take your company from being a 30-person company to a 50-person company to an 80-person company? I think those are discussions we need to have. And the things that come up again and again that I hear from people, and there's a variety of answers, but it's things like internet speeds, it's things like the airport, it's things like the border, which obviously the municipal government can't do much about the border, but these are the things that come up. And I think it's important to get out there and talk to people who are succeeding. And as well, what I've tried to do is talk to the companies that have left London and ask them, why did you leave? Where were the issues there? Biggest challenge, again, growth is going to come from exports. And I don't mean necessarily international exports, but This could be London selling things to companies in Toronto or elsewhere. But that's the idea, that London's growth is going to come through trade. That it's not just going to be London companies buying and selling from each other. So because of that, firms need to get goods to market in a timely and cost-effective manner. And again, goods are increasingly data-based, so this 21st century infrastructure is vitally important. Again, if we're not going to be able to compete in the 21st century economy if we're stuck with 1960s and 1970s style infrastructure. So the end. If you have questions or want copies of the slides, please email me at mmoffatt, so that's 2 M's, 2 F's, 2 T's, at ivy.ca, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. I've gotten a lot of them through through this chat. I'm sorry I only got to 2 or 3 of them. I think I'm over 50 now. So again, please send comments, questions, advice, what have you, to that address. And if I get a lot of interesting questions, which it looks like I have, I might do a follow-up to this, because it's always funner. It's always more fun and easier to answer the questions to a group of people rather than doing it individually one at a time. So thank you for this. So again, I'll try and answer as many questions as I can. I have recorded this, so I'm hoping that sticks. And if everything worked out okay with the recording, I'll throw this up on YouTube. So thank you.